Okay, so these are slides that are pretty randomly put together of both the projects that I'm going to talk to you about, which are titled Breathing for Biagio Walking and Walking Slowly Downhill. And first I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the original owners of the land we're on and their elders past and present. I was moved to hear yesterday that those of us who arrived here from other countries didn't in fact migrate to the Commonwealth of Australia, but to a land protected by a sovereign federation of First Nations people who had cared for the life of this land for over 65,000 years. And that felt to me far more authentic than the kind of illusory history that we were faced with when we arrived here in 1956. I wish that we had been welcomed by such a story. And I dedicate this talk, brief as it's going to be, to the memory of my parents, who responded to their original condition with amazing bravery, and they took on the longest possible journey as far south as possible. They did this like countless others who have created in part the complex realities that we're here to examine and discuss. And they took on this journey with no money, no language, no possessions, simply with hope. And I'd like to preface this little talk as well with a very tiny William Wordsworth poem that says this: should the guide I choose be making better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. So in June 1956, my family and I departed from the port of Trieste on the ex-hospital ship Toscana. We arrived in Fremantle in early August. Upon disembarking, one of our fellow passengers, a middle-aged Sicilian named Biagio non si sa, immediately set out on foot for Melbourne. 3 months later, he died of unknown causes in Kalgoorlie. 47 years later, as a response to this experience, I undertook a walk from the port of Fremantle to the wheatbelt town of Calabarin, 200 kilometres due west of Fremantle. I titled this project Breathing for Biagio Walking in order to both commemorate and complete Biagio's attempt to flee from his anxiety, which is a condition that I and my family and most of the other passengers all knew too well. The second project is titled Walking Slowly Downhill, and it commenced when on the new moon morning of Sunday, September 13, 2015, I began to walk steadily downhill from Mount Kosciuszko, acknowledged as the principal watershed of the Murray River. Over the next 14 weeks, I walked along various roads and tracks bordering the Victorian side of the river until I reached the Murray's mouth at Goolwa in South Australia on the new moon of January 10, 2016. Why did I take on these two walking projects? Walking long distances, by definition, always takes one beyond the bounds of one's life. This kind of walking might then be defined as an act of faith, because any departure, even when taking on a very short journey, underlines one's belief in an arrival. And so in order to complete the journey and validate its consequent act of faith, one must walk steadily, devotedly, existing almost beyond the act itself. One can walk either in order to lose or to find, at times perhaps both, because losing and finding are interlinked. We've always walked. We're essentially dwellers, walking in order to find the home we can embody. This home might be temporal or spiritual, or even exist out of time and space. For some of us, the act of walking itself might be the home we seek. What you're seeing are slides from a project I took on subsequent to the walk, and that was because I believed that the energy that Biagio expended on his walk to Kalgoorlie still remained at the borders of the road. I took on a project where I stopped every 10 kilometres and opened the car door, this was at night after work, and made an image of whatever it was that I felt was out there. And the image was made blindfolded on a small piece of canvas board, and it was carried back to Perth, where I was living at the time. And what you're seeing are the images or what I could see through the car door. Sometimes something, sometimes nothing. I didn't actually see it, I was blindfolded. So what do I know about walking? Perhaps nothing at all, or plenty. Why did I walk from Fremantle's harbour to the wheat belt town of Calabarin, and from the snows of Kosciuszko to their melted water streaming into the southern ocean of Goulburn? I'm not sure, but I'll tell you why I think I did it. Firstly, though, I have to tell you that everyone walked where I come from, and walking became embedded in my sense of self as the only means through which one engages with the wider world. My grandfather walked every day from the room we all lived in to his little tailor's shop down by the harbour in the oldest part of Trieste. During the Second World War, my mother walked 3 times a week from Trieste to the Friuli countryside, 80 kilometres away, in order to come back with a few shrivelled potatoes and beans, perhaps some eggs her country relatives had given her. Throughout the same period, my father would set out at midnight to walk in full military uniform the 50 kilometres from Gorizia, the town where he was stationed, to Trieste, in order to spend an hour or two with his fiancée and her parents. He would then walk back to Gorizia so he could reach his barracks before dawn. And 4 years later, his fiancée would become my mother. And I have to say that my daughter and my granddaughter are here today, so I thank them for coming. I first walked slowly through Fremantle's High Street with my parents on the day we landed, staring in silent astonishment at the deserted windswept village made up of grim, boarded-up, low-rise warehouses. We and many of our fellow passengers wandered around not knowing what we were looking for and certainly not finding anything at all that we could recognise. A few days later, as we crossed mountainous seas in the Great Australian Bight, we came to know that one of the passengers, a Sicilian farmer named Biagio, had left the ship in Fremantle in order to walk to his relatives in Melbourne, because his mind had unravelled simply through the absence of his earth under his feet, surrounded for 40 days and nights by the unending expanse of ocean. Years later, we heard he had managed to reach Kalgoorlie, where he immediately died. It was rumoured of heartbreak, desperation, malinconia, perhaps, I have since considered, of an Antipodean version of Stendhal's syndrome. But what do I remember of Biagio? Just this one memory. When ships pass through the line of the equator, the passengers and the crew of any vessel ritually celebrate Neptune, the mythical ruler of the deep. Our own celebrations allowed us all a momentary respite from the anxiety that preyed on each passenger. But while most dressed up in various costumes and sang and drank, Biagio wept inconsolably, staring at the sea. I remember him standing right next to me, tears streaming down his brown face, each teardrop picking up the reflected glitter and gloss of the coloured party lights strung up across the deck. I wondered then as a 9-year-old, and I wonder still, how many Biagios have crisscrossed this land, fleeing in desperation deep into the heart of the continent, away from the huge oceans that had carried them all the way south, only to meet the endless desert ocean face to face. So what do I remember of my walk to Calabarin? Only that it was driven by a great desire to retrace Biagio's steps, wanting to see what he might have seen, wanting to feel what he might have felt, what he was fleeing from, and perhaps what he surrendered to ultimately. And these are just some notes I made at the time. On the morning of November 2, I begin my journey. I resolve to walk each day for as long as I can, planning to arrive in Calabarin 7 days later to coincide with the full moon of November 9. I carry a suitcase as I head down High Street towards Midland as unobtrusively as possible. The next day I get to the edge of the endless warehouses and I start to climb towards the escarpment. And then there are some accounts here of the difficulty of walking with trucks hurtling down towards you. Mm-hmm. Then I wonder what shoes Biagio might have worn. Light passeggiata shoes, perhaps. I'm sure he wasn't ready for a walk to Melbourne. The two-tone ones with cream and tan-coloured leather delicately engraved with floral patterns. I'm sure you've all seen them. I have to constantly alternate the carrying hand, and both hands after a few kilometres are already swollen. I realise that I can't recall one thing one single thought that I've had since I start walking. This is during the walk. And then I start singing, of course. That's what happens when your head is empty. And then a single thought appears, at first tiny, then momentous. What if Biagio had died of ecstasy? What if at the beginning he had been filled with terror and melancholy, and then gradually, as he became increasingly shipwrecked within the vast inland ocean, his walk had ended in bliss as he finally understood that surrendering to fear is the key to its dissolution, and ecstasy is the natural consequence of surrender. As I close in on Calabarin on the final day, I come to realise how privileged I am to be able to reflect upon such seemingly ephemeral realities, seemingly inconsequential memories, while the business of living and dying is going on all around me. As I reach the outskirts of Calabarin, the full moon rises high over the wheat fields all around me, and I feel silent and invisible companions, Biagio among them, joining me to celebrate once more a reaffirmation of what we already know. But why does this project's title begin with To Love, which was missed out in the title that you all have? It begins with To Love. Because both actions that I'm describing to you resulted in my experiencing a kind of strange love. In breathing for Biagio, walking, a love for a person I never knew or would never come to know, and in walking slowly downhill, an unexpected love for the heart of this continent. A heart unknown and unknowable to me, a heart whose steady beating I've always attempted to pretend I couldn't hear. A beating whose sounding had for 6 decades fueled my own particular anxiety because it proposed the presence of a life force I couldn't understand nor encompass. Why do I believe then that what I feel is love rather than an odd mixture of admiration, guilt, regret, longing, curiosity, or even some kind of arrogant vanity? I've come to believe that the love seed was planted in me the moment I saw the flat grey monotones of the foggy Western Australian coast in the winter of 1956 as our ship approached Fremantle Harbour. Paradoxically, at that moment, I was also gripped by a child's unreasoned fear of the great unknown, the same fear that I believe Biagio must have also experienced surrounded by a vast ocean. This fear took root in me and began to thrive rhizomatically through my whole being, manifesting at the most unexpected times with the oddest of oddly anxious flora. It's a flora that has resisted my every attempt to uproot it, to deprive it of water, to snip it at the base. And just like Biagio's story, it's here, still in me, alive and well. But we all know that only paradox can lead to love. After much reflection, then, this is what I've concluded. In his attempt to flee his agoraphobic fear of the endless ocean, Biagio ended up coming face to face with it once more in the vast open plains of WA, perhaps finally surrendered to it just before reaching Kalgoorlie. And what of my own fear? Through my walks deep into the heart of the continent, I've come to finally release the anxiety that its vastness had stirred in me since I was a child. Consequently, I've reasoned that even when one is surrounded by fear, love remains the nutrient most essential to one's continued breathing. It's what at the end, when all else dissolves, remains, to both fuel surrender and perhaps the consequent journey towards ecstasy. Walking slowly downhill, and I'm walking quickly downhill. The following account describes the undertaking of a long walk as a mindful beginner might, welcoming the world as it is, rather than rationalising one's experience as an affirmation of one's knowledge, though it all be illusory. On the new moon of Sunday, September 13, 2015, I began to walk slowly downhill from Mount Kosciuszko, acknowledged as the principal watershed of the Murray. Over the next 14 weeks, I continued walking along various roads and tracks bordering the Victorian side of the river until I reached the river's mouth. This slow walk of 1,650 kilometres was undertaken with the permission of the elders of each of the Indigenous nations that have inhabited the Murray River country from source to mouth since time immemorial. Why did I want to undertake this journey? Because I wanted for the first time to approach this walk as the stranger and beginner I've always been, in order to enable me to face each new day as if I still inhabited my original self, the one that arrived in Australia on the 6th of August 56. I anticipated that this approach, generated by the need to experience as directly as possible the energetic qualities of the continent I've lived in for the last 60 years, might provide me with the insights I was seeking in order to dispel my resistance to what I sensed was its undeniable power. In order to continue this narrative, I had to now ask myself, what is a stranger? Beyond perhaps a simplistic Camusian interpretation, to my mind the stranger lives both an unbelonging and an unbelonged life, as one who is perennially unhinged from one's core, the core from which one's cultural connectedness both manifests and is experienced, and whose roots can be traced back for at least a few generations. The unhinging of a stranger from his or her original earth can neither be undone nor effectively rehinged, and only rarely might a successful transplantation into new soil be achieved. Consequently, it's most likely that the stranger, for the overwhelming majority of his or her lifetime, lives in separation from the whole, inside a space that can only sustain a single being. Yeah, I won't include that. We're running out of time, aren't we?
Yes, you have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. I wanted to walk the Murray's length because it is, as a stranger and beginner, because it's the most culturally important river in Australia, both since colonisation and certainly since time immemorial before it. Consequently, I wanted to honour all the histories, black, white and in between, that have come to define the river's endlessly changing human and ecological profiles. I wanted to walk because walking is slow, and so one is able to feel the slope of the ground and the force of the wind, the sting of the rain and the burning of the sun's heat, consequently experiencing the plenitude of Murray River country abounding all around. I consider that I might then for the first time be able to reflect with greater clarity upon what it might mean to live in this continent. I now realise that instead of embracing the new, I had constantly gravitated, as many migrants do, to whatever could remind me most intensely of all that I had left behind, assiduously taking refuge in anything I could retrieve of my original culture as echoes, even if very faint ones, of its faraway existence, avoiding as much as I possibly could the disconcerting new reality of living as a stranger. I've only recently understood that through this refuge-seeking I was simply all the while deepening a dependence on my cultural origins, all in exchange for a vacuous life, experienced in the main as simply the numbing absence of discomfort, as opposed to the energising joy that results from living a purposefully engaged life. This dependence facilitated a denial of my then self, and further disabled any desire to better understand the cultural tangles and consequent psychological outcomes that destiny had assigned me. Upon gaining this understanding, I have for the last few years increasingly sought whatever opportunities come my way to confront what I'd always feared and attempted to avoid, a direct experience of the huge reach of Australia's open inland spaces. Embedded in the endless land and its vast skies. As a consequence, I now live in Mildura, some 550 kilometres directly north of Melbourne, and a gateway to the continent's interior. I don't know where to go now because there's not enough time to read you anything. How long have we got? 1 minute?
Yeah.
Oh,
you actually got a few extra minutes, so you do need to end it with one more.
Okay. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.